The fog clung to Little Thistle like a phantom, winding its ghostly fingers around the village as if reluctant to let go. It pooled in the narrow lanes, curled around the twisted branches of ancient oaks, and whispered against the stone walls of ivy-clad cottages. There was an eerie stillness to the place, the kind that settled deep in the bones and made the hairs at the nape of one's neck prickle. The only movement came from the reluctant exhale of smoke from chimneys, curling upward before vanishing into the murky dawn. Somewhere in the distance, a lone church bell tolled, slow, deliberate, as if mourning something lost. At first glance, Little Thistle was the picture of tranquility, a quaint, unassuming village nestled between rolling hills, with cobbled streets that twisted and turned as if they had no particular destination. But beneath that quiet charm, beneath the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, there was something else, something unseen but felt. A tension in the air, a whisper beneath the silence. A carriage emerged from the mist, its wheels groaning against the uneven stones. The chestnut mare that pulled it moved with the unhurried precision of an animal that knew its way by heart. The driver, a man in his 50s with a face lined by years on the road, sat hunched against the cold, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. He did not look around, did not greet the occasional figure that emerged from the fog before vanishing again. Perhaps he knew better than to pay too much attention in a village where watching too closely could mean seeing more than one ought to. Seated inside the carriage, hands folded neatly in her lap, was Miss Jane Marple. At first glance, she seemed an unremarkable figure, a small elderly woman dressed in sensible tweed, her face lined with age, her expression one of quiet contemplation. But those who mistook her for a simple old lady were always the ones to regret it. For beneath the soft exterior was a mind as sharp as a blade, and eyes that missed nothing. As the carriage rolled past the first archway leading into the village, Miss Marple caught sight of a familiar sign, the Little Thistle Tea Room. The name was painted in neat cursive, though the sign itself tilted ever so slightly, as if someone had adjusted it in haste. And just beyond it, in the doorway, stood a woman with hands that trembled ever so slightly as she set the sign back into place. Miss Marple's lips curled at the corners, just a fraction. She had spent enough years observing human nature to know that fear was a thing rarely hidden well, and that woman, whoever she was afraid. The mare plodded forward, hooves striking against the stone in a slow rhythmic beat. No need to hurry. The tea room would still be there when she arrived, and so would its secrets. Inside the Little Thistle Tea Room, the scent of steep tea and freshly baked scones filled the air. The warmth of the afternoon sun filtered through lace-curtained windows, bathing the wooden tables in a golden glow. It was a place of comfort, of predictable routine, or at least it was meant to be. But Miss Marple had long ago learned that places like this, the cozy ones, the ordinary ones, often held the darkest secrets. She took a seat by the window, her back to the wall so that she could watch the entire room with ease. A delicate porcelain teapot sat before her, its handle worn smooth from years of use. She did not pour herself a cup. Not yet. First, there was always more to observe. The villagers, those few who had not already left for the day, sat in small clusters, their voices low, but even in whispers, certain words had a way of standing out to a trained ear. Trial, someone murmured. Collingwood, another voice added, hushed and wary. Wyndham Man, came a third, followed by the faint clink of cutlery against china. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the table. Captain Edward Collingwood, Major Charles Wyndham. Names that carried weight, names tied to something unpleasant. The trial had been a scandal, a dark stain on the village's otherwise picturesque existence. But trials were never just about the crime itself. No, they were about what came before, about what festered beneath the surface, long before the world took notice. The proprietor of the tea room approached, a woman with sharp features and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She carried herself with the practiced ease of someone who had been in the business long enough to know exactly how to present herself. But Miss Marple was not fooled. She could see the tension in the woman's shoulders, the stiffness in her movements. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," the woman said too cheerily. "What can I get for you today?" "A spot of tea, thank you," Miss Marple replied, her voice quiet, unassuming. The woman nodded and turned, but Miss Marple's attention was already elsewhere. Her gaze drifted back to the table of villagers, to the murmurs and fragments of conversation that told more than they meant. This was no ordinary gossip, no idle chatter over biscuits and jam. This was something heavier, something that pressed against the walls of the tea room, thick as the morning fog outside. Miss Marple knew, as surely as she knew the taste of a good Darjeeling, that the whispers in Little Thistle were not just echoes of the past. No, they were the first stirrings of something new, a puzzle just beginning to take shape. And puzzles, as she well knew, were meant to be solved. The fog clung to Little Thistle like a spectre, winding through the village streets with a silent, creeping intent. It coiled around the gnarled branches of the ancient oaks and slithered through the gaps between old stone cottages, as if the very air carried secrets too heavy to be seen in the light of day. A lone church bell tolled in the distance, slow and deliberate, each chime a whisper of something unspoken. At first glance, Little Thistle was the kind of place that belonged in a postcard, quaint, untouched by time, a picture of serenity. But Miss Jane Marple knew better. She had seen enough of life to recognize that tranquility was often a disguise, and beneath the sleepy charm of this village, something simmered, something no one dared to voice. A carriage emerged from the mist, its wheels groaning against the uneven cobblestones. The chestnut mare leading it moved with the unhurried certainty of an animal that knew the path by heart. The driver, a man in his 50s, kept his eyes fixed ahead, as if he understood that looking too closely in a place like this could lead to seeing things best left unseen. Inside the carriage, Miss Marple sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face was soft, unassuming, the kind that one could pass on the street without a second glance, but her sharp, watchful eyes missed nothing. As the carriage rolled under the stone archway marking the entrance to the village, her gaze flickered to a sign swinging gently in the breeze, the Little Thistle tea room. It had been adjusted recently, though not carefully. It tilted slightly, a detail that might have seemed insignificant to most, but not to Miss Marple. In the doorway of the tea room stood a woman. Her hands trembled as she reached to straighten the sign again, only for a moment, just long enough for Miss Marple to notice. A subtle smile curled at the corners of her lips. She had seen fear before, and she saw it now. The mare trudged forward, its hooves echoing in the stillness. No need to rush. Secrets had a way of revealing themselves in time. The Little Thistle tea room was warm, inviting, a sanctuary from the damp chill outside. The scent of steeped tea and fresh scones drifted through the air, wrapping around the room like an old memory. Golden afternoon light filtered through lace-curtained windows, illuminating the polished wooden tables and the quiet hum of whispered conversation. Miss Marple took a seat by the window, her back to the wall. She never sat anywhere she couldn't see the whole room. A porcelain teapot rested on the table before her, its delicate handle worn smooth from years of use. But she did not pour herself a cup. Not yet. The villagers, scattered in their usual groups, spoke in hushed tones, low murmurs, careful glances, words not meant for outsiders, except for those who knew how to listen. "Trial," someone muttered. "Collingwood," another voice added, barely audible. "Wyndham," came a third, followed by the soft clink of cutlery against china. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the table. Captain Edward Collingwood, Major Charles Wyndham. A trial that had shaken the village to its very core. But there was something more here. This was not idle gossip. This was something deeper, older. The sharp-featured woman who had greeted her moments ago stood behind the counter, her face pale, her hands clasped in front of her, clasped too tightly. There was a slight tremor, barely noticeable, but Miss Marple noticed. She allowed the silence to settle around her, as if waiting, as if allowing the whispers in the air to weave themselves into something tangible. She had learned long ago that the past had a way of pressing against the present, no matter how deeply one tried to bury it. She sipped her tea, cold now. It didn't matter. The truth was beginning to surface. The courtroom stood with the rigid grandeur of a past era, mahogany walls gleaming under the dim light, brass fixtures polished to a deceptive shine, but beneath its stately appearance, there was something else, a fragility, a sense that like an antique mirror, it had been handled too many times, and one more touch might shatter it. The air inside was thick, stifling, it clung to the skin like the weight of 100 unsaid words. At the defendant's table sat Captain Edward Collingwood. His posture was rigid, hands folded neatly in front of him. The uniform he wore, perfectly pressed, meticulously kept, did little to mask the exhaustion in his face. His eyes, sharp but dulled by fatigue, swept over the room. The whispers, the rustling papers, the judge seated high above him. His face an unreadable mask of authority. The gavel slammed down. Order in the court. The murmurs died instantly, but the tension remained, thick as smoke from a fire no one wanted to ignore. Collingwood's lips tightened, but he said nothing. He wasn't here to speak. He was here to wait. In the back of the room, the gallery buzzed with barely contained curiosity. The murder of Major Charles Wyndham had become more than just a crime. It was a spectacle. The nation watched with bated breath, captivated not just by the act itself, but by the long and tangled history that lay beneath it. The prosecution painted a damning picture, a soldier with a fractured mind, a man haunted by old ghosts, pushed to murder to silence them. They twisted every event in his past, every shadow of doubt, until it became a noose around his neck, and then came the witnesses, veterans, one after another, hardened men with lined faces and hollowed eyes. They each had their own story, their own version of the truth. One old soldier stepped forward, his hands unsteady as he took the stand. His uniform, though patched and worn, was straightened with the dignity of a man who had seen too much to let himself break. His eyes met Collingwood's. There was something in them, a knowing. When he spoke, his voice was rough, frayed at the edges. I was there. The courtroom stilled. It was supposed to be a routine operation, he continued. Just another raid, behind enemy lines. But it wasn't. Not that night. A pause, a deep breath. Something happened. The gallery leaned in, the air heavy with expectation. The moment stretched taut as a wire about to snap. Collingwood's jaw tightened, his fingers curled slightly against the table, and Miss Marple, seated quietly among the spectators, did what she did best. She watched, because the truth, however deeply buried, however carefully hidden, had a way of coming to light, and when it did, there would be no turning back. Like they told us, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the tension in the air thickening with every word we were told to clear the area, make sure. There were no survivors. The orders were clear, but no one expected what we found. He paused, his face tightening. Wyndham, he was in charge, but it wasn't him who gave the orders. No, it was Collingwood, Captain. Collingwood gave the orders. Miss Jane Merrill sat at the back of the room, unobtrusive, as always, small frame blended into the shadows, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. She watched the courtroom unfold with the same careful attention she'd given the villagers. In Little Thistle, noting the subtle movements, the glances exchanged, the reactions of those present. As the veteran spoke, Miss Marple's mind slipped away from the here and now, back to the battlefield. An image formed, half remembered, of men in muddy trenches, the scent of gunpowder thick in the air. She felt the pull of the memory, the smell, the sound of distant explosions. But it wasn't her memory, it was the soldier's flashback. The moon hung low over a remote battlefield, its pale light casting long shadows across the trenches. The men were huddled together, crouching in the muck, the cold goring at their bones. Collingwood stood at the front, his silhouette a stark figure against the night sky. His eyes were narrowed, scanning horizon, while Wyndham, farther behind, issued orders in a voice too low to carry the air, was thick with tension. Every movement measured. The men knew what was coming. They'd been trained for this moment. The raid behind enemy lines. It was supposed to be quick, clean, but the sound of gunfire shattered the silence, and with it the fragile illusion of control. Move out, Collingwood barked, his voice firm, unyielding. The soldiers moved with practiced ease, but something felt off, something Miss Merrill couldn't place in the distance. A small building was visible, half collapsed, its windows shattered. They were supposed to clear it out, but no one expected what they found. Inside the room was filled with bodies, fallen soldiers from both sides, their lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. But there was one man among them, not dead, but very much alive. He was young, too young to be here, and Collingwood's eyes met his for a fraction of a second, before the order was given. A quick shot, a clean kill. Miss Marple didn't need to hear the rest. She'd seen enough. The past was alive in the room, bleeding into the present. The courtroom shifted back into focus as the veteran finished his testimony. His hands shook violently, but his eyes were clear, his voice unsteady, but sure. Captain Collingwood gave the orders. He repeated, and they weren't the orders of a soldier, they were the orders of a murderer. There was a murmur among the crowd. Collingwood's eyes darted across the room. But no one would meet them. They had all heard the same story, the same accusation, ECT. The weight of it pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her fingers tightening around the edge of her notepad. The pieces were falling into place. But something was off. The veteran's testimony was damning. Yes, but there was something in the way he'd spoken that didn't sit right with her. It wasn't guilt she'd heard in his voice. It was fear, and that fear told her one thing. Someone else was pulling the strings. The trial would go on, but Miss Marple had seen enough. She didn't need to wait for the verdict to know that the truth was still buried, deep hidden beneath layers of lies, of fear, and of old war cries. She couldn't know the full story yet, but she would. She always did as the gavel came down again. Miss Marple stood, her small frame moving with surprising grace. The courtroom felt smaller now, confining, suffocating. She'd spent her life unraveling secrets, and this one was no different. The truth would come out. It always did, and when it did, everyone would be surprised by what they found. The courtroom had the feel of an old opera house designed for grandeur, but now trapped in the grind of routine. Dark wood panels lined the walls, polished to a dull sheen by decades of hands. Brushing past, the gaslight overhead hummed faintly, dimming the flicker of tension that thickened the air. The judge sat high, his expression stern, and the audience, composed mostly of local citizens, was all business eyes trained forward, like hawks watching. Captain Edward Collingwood sat at the defendant's table, his back straight, his hands folded in front of him, but he didn't hide the weariness behind his eyes. His face, tanned by years of military service, held the marks of a man who had seen too much and learned to live with it. The room seemed to close in on him like the thick fog of a battlefield. But this time it wasn't smoke he was choking on. It was judgment. The trial had already dragged on for days, but it was clear now that the true story wasn't going to come out without some prodding. The prosecution had been building a case of simple murder, a soldier gone mad, killed in a fit of rage. But there were other stories buried beneath the surface, and Collingwood knew them better than anyone. The courtroom murmur quieted as the next piece of evidence was brought forward. A photograph. The picture wasn't much to look at, old, faded, its corners curled and edges frayed from years of handling. The men in the photo were younger, more innocent perhaps, but there was something about their expressions that betrayed them. Collingwood and Major Charles Wyndham stood side by side in full military regalia, their faces serious but not unkind. But it wasn't the uniforms that caught the attention of the room. It was the shadows behind their eyes, the slight tension in their jawline that hinted at a darker history. The photo was placed on the courtroom table, and for a moment everyone seemed to hold their breath. The war, that unspoken chapter, the one no one really wanted to revisit, but that everyone secretly feared. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named Grayson, stepped forward, his voice cold. Here we have a photograph taken during the Great War. Notice the two men, Captain Collingwood and Major Wyndham. Both of them were present during the infamous operation at Whodunit, an operation that to this day remains under investigation. A collective shift in the room marked the weight of the words. The mention of Whodunit was enough to silence the whispers. The place was a cemetery for broken soldiers and forgotten promises. No one spoke of the atrocities that had taken place, at least not openly, but Grayson's statement made it impossible to ignore the elephant in the room. There are rumors, Grayson continued, glancing over at Collingwood, that both men were involved in a war crime during that operation, a decision made in the heat of battle, a decision that led to the deaths of many innocent men. His gaze lingered on the defendant's face. We do not have direct evidence to confirm this, but the implications are clear. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, her eyes sharp, despite her gentle demeanor. She didn't miss a thing. She'd seen this kind of dance before. The slow reveal of something buried deep, where one truth after another was dragged into the light, one piece at a time. It was like unwrapping a gift, each layer revealing more than you wanted to know. The photograph was just a hint, a whisper barely audible, but Miss Marple knew better than to ignore it. The look on Collingwood's face, as the photo was placed before him, was something she could read. The guilt wasn't written in the lines of his face, but in the way his eyes moved, flicking briefly to the photograph, then quickly away, as if the image itself were too much to bear. She had seen that look before, and it wasn't just the look of a soldier burdened by the past. No, this was something else. A look that told her there were ghosts in Collingwood's past and they weren't going to stay buried much longer. The trial went on. Witness after witness took the stand, recounting the same details. The tension between Collingwood and Wyndham, the whispered orders, the secrecy that surrounded their actions. But the stories felt incomplete. The more she heard, the more Miss Marple realized that this was not just a simple case of murder. This was a war crime dressed up in the form of a trial. The war had shaped these men, changed them in ways that even they couldn't fully comprehend. And now it was creeping into their lives pulling at the threads that had been knotted so tightly for so many years. But Miss Marple wasn't fooled by the surface. She knew the game, and she knew that this courtroom was just a stage. The real story lay elsewhere, hidden in the dusty corners of the past where secrets festered. The judge slammed his gavel down, signaling the break for lunch, and the room began to empty, the tension dissipating for a moment, though it would return as soon as the trial resumed. Miss Marple slipped quietly out of her seat, her small unassuming figure easily lost in the shuffle of lawyers and journalists. She made her way down the corridor and into the cooler, quieter hall, where she paused for a moment. Considering the tangled web she had just witnessed, there was something more to this trial than murder, something darker, and Miss Marple had a feeling that the courtroom was the least of the places where she'd find the truth. In the street outside, the city buzzed with the noise of a world that seemed far removed from the quiet intensity of the trial. But to Miss Marple the noise was a mask. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on the present, and as the crowd moved past her, she could hear the faintest whisper, like a forgotten memory, trying to claw its way back to the surface. The investigation was just beginning, and already Miss Marple knew that there was more to this than anyone had let on. She took a deep breath, adjusting the brim of her hat. As she set off toward the small office she kept on the outskirts of town, her mind was already at work, piecing together the past one fragment at a time. It wasn't always the obvious clues that led to the truth. Sometimes it was the quiet ones, the ones that whispered just under the surface, waiting to be noticed. And Miss Marple had never been one to miss a whisper. The drive from the courthouse to Wyndham's estate was short enough, but the further Miss Marple traveled from the center of town, the more the world seemed to shift. The streets grew narrow and twisted, the buildings fewer, until all that remained were country lanes that meandered through thick, darkened woods, the kind of place where people forgot to look back, or at least pretended not to. Wyndham's estate, once a proud manor nestled among acres of land, now stood in quiet, crumbling disrepair. Its grand entrance iron gates, rusted through, greeted her like an old soldier fallen on hard times. She could already feel the weight of the place, the kind that no amount of money or prestige could save from the slow decay of time. The driveway lined with gnarled trees, whose bare limbs scratched at the sky like skeletal fingers, led to a house that had once been resplendent. Now the windows were smudged with dirt, and the stone steps at the front door had worn down with age, like the steps of a man who had walked too far and too long. The place exhaled neglect. Miss Marple stepped out of the carriage, adjusting her gloves with that familiar precision. The air here was thick with something unsaid, something that clung to the walls of the house like mildew. She didn't need to step inside, feel it, but she did anyway. The door opened with a protest, a long drawn-out creak that reverberated off the stone. She pushed it gently, stepping into the grand hall, where time seemed to have stopped. Dust hung in the air, suspended like the last few breaths of a dying man. Portraits, once grand and formal, now sat dull and forgotten on the walls. Miss Mar's eyes shifted over them with practiced ease. She had seen too many people over the years whose lives had been painted in such grand strokes, only to be reduced to footnotes in forgotten histories. The hall was cavernous, the type of space designed to impress, not to live in. The floorboards groaned under her weight, and the walls were lined with dark wood paneling that made the air feel thick and close. It was a place where secrets festered, where they would never see the light of day, unless someone like her decided to drag them into the open. Miss Marple wandered through the ground floor, noting the wear in the carpets, the clutter of old furniture, and the faint scent of mothballs that filled the corners of the rooms. But it was the study that attention. She could feel the weight of the place draw her toward it like the pull of a magnet. The door was ajar, a slight gap in the wood beckoning her forward. She entered without hesitation. The study was small, but meticulously arranged, for a place that had been abandoned for so long. A desk sat near the far wall, its surface clean, except for the stray papers that had been left behind. An ornate chair sat behind it, and around the room were shelves filled with old military books, dusty knickknacks and faded maps. It was the kind of room that smelled of history, but beneath the surface, it felt stifled, like the air had been trapped here, unwilling to escape. The portraits that lined the walls were familiar. Some of them were recent. Wyndham standing tall with medals on his chest, a young officer full of pride, but there was a darkness in his eyes that Miss Marple recognized from the courtroom. A man had seen too much, perhaps too much to ever be fully whole again. Her fingers brushed lightly across the dusty volumes on a nearby shelf. They were all military histories, memoirs of battles fought, and lives lost, the kind of books that filled a man's life with a sense of purpose, even if that purpose had long since passed. But it was the desk that held her attention as she approached it. She noticed something out of place. A small wooden box on the far side. It looked innocuous enough, but when she slid it open, she found only a few faded letters and a photograph, an old black and white picture of two soldiers standing together facing the camera with an air of grim resolve. One of them was Wyndham, the other Captain Edward Collingwood, the same two men from the courtroom. They looked younger, naive, even like boys caught in a man's world. But it wasn't the photo that caught Miss Marple's eye. It was the small safe beneath the desk. It wasn't big, but it looked like it had been tampered with. The lock was scratched, its mechanism delicate, as though someone had tried, but failed to open it in a hurry. Miss Marple's fingers hovered over it for a moment. Then she bent down and began her search. She moved methodically, lifting books, shuffling papers. It was the same way she worked in every situation, slow, deliberate. She wasn't trying to force the truth out. She was letting it reveal itself at its own pace. Her efforts were rewarded when a small key hidden beneath a pile of documents caught the light from the dim window. The key was delicate, made of brass, and though it didn't belong to any of the drawers, it fit the safe's lock perfectly. She turned it. The contents of the safe were sparse. A few personal letters, some military memorabilia, and a small folded piece of paper, yellowed and slightly torn at the edges. She carefully unfolded it, her eyes scanning the text. It was a letter written in a hurried hand. The operation has been covered up. What was done at Verdun stays there, but you owe me. Edward, I'll keep my silence if you do. The same. Miss Marple folded the letter back and placed it on the desk with deliberate care. There was no need to keep it. She had read enough. Wyndham had made sure to leave his tracks well hidden, but he had forgotten one thing. The past doesn't stay buried for long. The letter hinted at more than just a war crime. It was a promise, a bargain sealed in blood. Wyndham's words were as heavy as the air in the room, and Miss Marple understood them all too well. The past had a way of coming back, whether you were ready for it or not. She looked back at the photograph. Once more Binger's face was different, now weathered and beaten, But the eyes told the same story. He'd been there just like Wyndham, and whatever had happened at Verdun, it hadn't been the first time they'd buried a secret. Miss Marple straightened, taking one last look at the study. It was a room, full of history, but now it was a room full of lies too. As she turned to leave, her mind already piecing together the next steps, she felt the faintest glimmer of satisfaction. This was just the beginning, but the game had changed, and this time Miss Marple wasn't going to wait for the truth to come to her. She was going to chase it down piece by piece until it had nowhere left to hide. Wyndham's estate loomed behind the thick hedge line, its windows dark and broken like the eyes of someone long dead. The once grand manor stood in sullen solitude, its great stone facade weathered by both time and neglect. The surrounding gardens, once cultivated with pride, had been overtaken by wild brambles and weeds that sprawled like the residue of forgotten promises. Miss Marple stepped lightly across the uneven grounds, her shoes making little sound against the dirt path. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of decay, as though the earth itself was tired of hiding the past. She didn't mind. It was in places like this where memory clung to the walls, and the past was only one step away from the present, that she did her best work. Her fingers brushed the cracked stone of the front step as she moved toward the She paused, taking a moment to survey the scene around her, carefully observing the half-hidden signs of a life that once was. The door creaked slightly as she pushed it open, stepping into the manor with a quiet resolve. Inside, the hall was like the estate itself, grand but over by the weight of years. The walls were lined with old portraits of men in stiff collars and hard dresses. Their eyes were the same, hard, calculating, as if they knew everything, and still didn't care to share it. Miss Marple didn't care much for the portraits. She knew enough about men who made their mark on history to know their eyes were the most dangerous part of them. She moved swiftly through the rooms, her senses sharp, her mind already piecing together the few facts that had surfaced thus far. The trial, the photograph, the whispers of war. Nothing added up, not yet, but something about the place, the way it seemed to swallow up time, suggested that the answers were buried deep within. She found the study almost by accident, tucked behind a forgotten library, its door slightly ajar. She pushed it open, the hinges protesting with a groan. The room was a relic, furniture untouched, dust lain thick over everything. Papers, some scattered and some neatly piled, sat on a desk by the window, and the light from outside filtered through the grime cupboard, panes casting muted shadows over the room. It was what she expected. There was no artifice, no grand display, just the clutter of a man who had spent too much time with his thoughts. Miss Marple moved toward the desk, her gloved hands careful as they skimmed the papers. Letters from war buddies, a few legal documents, a photograph of Collingwood and Wyndham during the war. There was no doubt in her mind. Now the two men were more connected than anyone had let on. She glanced at the desk again, and saw a letter folded with some care. She opened it slowly, scanning its contents. Your silence was promised, but so was mine. If you seek peace, you will find no answer in the past. We've buried it too deeply for it to rise again. Miss Marple set the letter down carefully. The words were a threat, a promise of silence, but more importantly, they suggested a secret that both men had hidden away, one that had yet to see the light of day. She could feel the weight of the room shift as she lingered over the letter. Whatever Wyndham had buried, Collingwood had agreed to keep it hidden, but for how long? The sound of footsteps broke her concentration, and Miss Marple turned toward the door. A figure stood in the threshold, a man ragged, and hunched, his hands buried in his coat pockets. His face was rough, his features half hidden by a grizzled beard, but there was something in the way he watched her that suggested he had been waiting. I know what you're looking for, the man said quietly, his voice thick with an accent she couldn't quite place. Miss Marple didn't flinch. She'd seen this type before, locals who were far too curious for their own good, who knew more than they should, but never let on. She gave him a smile, the kind that was both polite and cold. I'm afraid I'm not looking for anything in particular, she said, her tone light, just taking in the atmosphere. The man stepped closer, his boots dragging across the floor. I heard you at the front gate, he said, Voice low, almost conspiratorial. "The mysterious visitor, the one who came on the night of the murder, saw him myself walking round the property. Not much to look at. I thought it was a ghost at first." Miss Marple's interest piqued, but she didn't let it show a ghost. She repeated, raising an eyebrow. The man nodded, his eyes glancing nervously over his shoulder, as if the very mention of ghosts might bring them to life. "You can't tell me you didn't hear the stories," muttered, glancing at the papers she had left on the desk about Wyndham's old dealings. "They don't call him the Devil's Lieutenant for nothing. The man was up to his neck in trouble, and everyone knew it, so when someone came around asking questions, well, things don't end pretty. Not here, not in this house." Miss Marple took a slow breath. The words were meant to rattle, but she had grown used to the way people tried to distort the facts. She had a knack for reading between the lines. The man was afraid of something, but it wasn't ghosts, it was fear of the truth. She leaned back slightly, narrowing her eyes. "You didn't answer my question," she said. "What did you see?" The man shifted uncomfortably. "Nothing much," he said, his voice shaking. "Just a shadow. A figure. I'm not saying it was Collingwood, but well, you know how it is. The past don't die easy. Sometimes it comes back to haunt you." Miss Marple gave a polite smile, but her mind was already racing. A mysterious visitor, a shadow at the scene. Everything was adding layers of complexity to a case that seemed at first straightforward enough. The groundskeeper left as quickly as he had arrived, disappearing into the corridors of the estate. But Miss Marple knew he'd left behind more than just a whisper. The mention of a visitor was a clue, but it was one that she would have to tuck away for now along with everything else. As the groundskeeper's footsteps faded, Miss Marple stood and turned to leave the study. She had gathered enough for one day, but the pieces were far from complete. The estate with its dark corners and tangled history had more to say. She stepped back into the fading light of the afternoon, the orange and pink hues of dusk creeping across the sky like an omen. The estate seemed to settle into the evening, shadows holding its breath. She was already halfway down the steps when she stopped and looked back at the house. One last time, the weight of the unanswered questions pressed against her mind, but she didn't mind. It was what she did best. The investigation had only just begun, and there was more to discover, if she was willing to dig deep enough to find it. The estate loomed in the distance, as Miss Marple walked toward the waiting carriage, the last light of the day painting the world in shades of grey. The shadows were growing longer, but her resolve had never been clearer. The village had a way of looking the same, day after day, like a photograph that hadn't quite captured the essence of life. The houses sat too still, the streets too clean, and the air, while fresh, felt a little too quiet. But beneath the surface of Little Thistle, something was stirring, something that refused to stay buried. Miss Marple sat in the corner of the small pub, her back to the wall, and her eyes on the door. The regulars were mostly men, soldiers who had taken to living out their post-war lives. In the quiet of a village that barely noticed their presence, they were the ones who had seen too much, whose faces held stories they would never tell. She knew how to spot them. It was in the way they carried themselves, slightly off balance, as if the past still had a grip on their shoulders. The pub was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and tobacco smoke. The clinking of glasses and the soft murmur of conversation filled the space, but it was a kind of murmur that only carried so far. No one wanted to speak too loudly here, not with the memory they carried. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her fingers racked tightly around the cup. The village was full of rumors, but it was in places like this, the quiet corners and the unspoken moments, that the truth would slip out. The first man she approached was an older fellow sitting alone by the fire, his shoulders hunched as if he was still bearing the weight of something heavy. His name was Tom, and Miss Marple had learned that he'd served under Wyndham's command during the war. She knew that the man's eyes would tell her more than his lips would, so she started slow. "Wyndham was a tough one, wasn't he?" she said, her voice measured calm. Tom didn't look up at her, just stared into his glass. You could say that he muttered. His voice gravy. "Didn't say much, did he? A man like that doesn't give his men much room to breathe. Miss Marple's tone was casual, but there was something underneath it, an understanding that didn't need to be voiced. She wasn't asking for facts, she was asking for a reaction. Tom's eyes flickered toward her for the first time, and Miss Marple could see the flash of something in them, something that wasn't quite guilt, but something that could be mistaken for it. He didn't need to talk. Tom replied. We knew where we stood with him. There it was. She didn't need any more. Miss Marple took a long sip of her tea, letting the silence stretch out between them. Not much room for mistakes in the field. Eh? She asked as if the thought had just come to her. Tom shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around his glass. Not if you want to stay alive, he muttered. Then he stared at the floor, as if the answer wasn't meant for anyone else. Miss Marple nodded, letting the weight of his words settle before standing to leave. She turned to the door, but before she could reach it another figure caught her eye. A younger man sitting in the corner, his face pale and drawn, his hands shook, as he lit a cigarette, his eyes darting toward the door, every few seconds, as though he were afraid someone might see him. She recognized him from the trial. His name was Harry, former soldier under Collingwood's command. He had been there the night of the murder, but hadn't spoken much in the courtroom. His silence had always been more telling than his testimony. Miss Marple made her way to his table, sitting down across from him with a pleasant smile. Mind if I join you? She asked, her voice warm, but firm. Harry looked at her for a long moment, his eyes nervous but calculating. He hadn't expected her to approach him so directly, and he didn't seem sure whether to engage or not. But Miss Marple knew better than to let him squirm. You knew Wyndham, didn't you? She asked, her voice quiet enough to keep the conversation private. Harry's eyes flickered, but he didn't speak. At first she waited. He was a hard man. Harry said finally, his voice tight, kept things close to the chest, too close. And Collingwood, Miss Marple pressed. He was your commanding officer, wasn't he? Harry shifted in his seat, glancing over his shoulder, as if to make sure no one was listening. Collingwood, he wasn't much better, but he was different, more of a soldier's soldier, didn't care about the politics, just the fight. Miss Marple tilted her head, studying him. Not much room for thinking, was there? Harry looked up startled, as though she'd peeled back a layer. He hadn't meant to expose. No, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There wasn't there, it was the truth. Slowly bleeding out, Collingwood and Wyndham, two men who had spent their lives in a war that had long since ended for everyone else. The war hadn't just taken lives, it had taken pieces of them, things that could never be returned. Miss Marple left the pub soon after, her mind heavy with what she had heard. These men, these veterans, they had lived through the same battles, the same wars, but each carried a different scar. Some had been broken by it, others had buried it deep inside. The village library was quiet. When she arrived, the air was cool, the smell of old paper and leather filling her senses. She moved through the stacks, her fingers trailing over the books as she searched for something, anything that might connect the present to the past. The timeline of events was key. She knew that, but there were too many pieces missing. The trial had brought things to light, but it hadn't revealed everything. The library's small reading desk was where she found herself, bent over an old military records book. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded in places, but the names were still there, etched into the history of the war. Miss Marple skimmed the pages, pausing every so often to cross record name, states and operations. She traced the movements of both Wyndham and Collingwood through the records, each new detail weaving a clearer picture. The pieces were starting to fall into place, just a few more connections, and she would have it as she flipped to a particularly worn page. Something caught her eye. Ooh. A mention of a covert operation, one that had been quietly swept under the rug by Hups. Miss Marple's fingers stopped on a name that hadn't been mentioned in the trial, but should have been. She glanced up as she heard footsteps approaching. A man entered the library, one she recognized from earlier in the day, a soldier who had served under Wyndham and Collingwood. He moved toward her, his face tense. He leaned down, slipping something into her hand. It was a crumpled piece of paper folded in half. "Don't mention this," he whispered. "The past never stays buried, but maybe it should." The note was short, cryptic. A warning or a confession? Miss Marple's eyes scanned it quickly. It read, "The night of the murder, the anniversary of Veron. You're not the only one who remembers." The note went still in her hands, the words sinking into her like the final nail in a coffin. The timing had been deliberate. The anniversary wasn't just an accident. Someone had made sure it happened. Then Miss Marple stood, her face hardening. The man's eyes were full of regret, but they were also full of fear. He knew too much, and now she did too. As she left the library, the shadows of the evening seemed deeper, darker. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her shoulders. This wasn't just a case of murder, it was a case of retribution, and the strings were tangled so tightly that even she wasn't sure who was pulling them. The truth was out there, hidden beneath layers of memory and guilt, waiting for her to uncover it, and she would, one piece at a time. Miss Marple sat in her modest room at the local inn, a small uninspiring place, tucked on the edge of Little Thistle outside the quiet of the village, had already settled in for the night, but inside the room was alive with the scattered remnants of the room was dimly lit, the single overhead lamp buzzing faintly as it cast elongated shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The air smelled of old parchment, wax and dust, like a place where time had stopped moving. Against the far wall stood a corkboard cluttered with newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and hurriedly scribbled notes. Each piece, each scrap of information, was like a shard of broken glass, disconnected on its own, but together, forming the outline of something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. Miss Marple stood before it, hands folded neatly, eyes sharp as she took it all in. The village of Little Thistle had secrets, buried deep beneath the quiet hum of daily life, and she could feel the weight of them pressing against the stillness of the room. Somewhere in the tangled web of headlines, trial records and war reports, the truth lay waiting. The murder, the trial, the war crimes. The past was clawing its way to the surface, demanding to be heard. Her fingers traced a thin thread that stretched from one corner of the board to another, from Major Charles Wyndham's portrait, stiff and proud in his uniform, to Captain Edward Collingwood, standing beside him in a photograph taken before the war had hardened their faces. There was something in the way they stood together, not camaraderie, not friendship, but a shared understanding. A terrible, unspoken truth. Below the photograph, pinned like a forgotten relic, was a snippet from the local newspaper: Major Charles Wyndham found dead at his country estate. Official cause murder. The words were stark, clinical, devoid of the weight they carried. It was more than a headline. It was the beginning of a reckoning. She stepped back, studying the board with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime unraveling tangled lies. The details alone weren't enough, they never were. But together, they whispered of something dark, something carefully hidden. Miss Marple had no illusions. Secrets never stayed buried forever. Then a creak at the door. She turned, unfazed, as the innkeeper stepped in, his face wary, his hands clutching a small wrapped package. "This came for you," he said, voice hushed. She took it, the paper crackling as she unfolded it carefully. Inside was a bundle of old letters, their ink faded, their edges worn soft with time. Most were personal correspondences, harmless on the surface, until she found one, a single letter. The words scrawled with urgency: "You will keep your promise, if not I will speak. And when I speak, the truth will be worse than death. Remember the woman." Miss Marple's breath stilled. The woman. The word hit her like a slap of icy wind. A battlefield, a massacre, a place where men had died in ways no one spoke of, and now it had returned, dragged into the present by the ghosts who refused to rest. She tucked the letter away, her mind already moving to the next step. She needed to speak with those who had witnessed the past firsthand. The tavern, a place of unspoken truths. The next evening, Miss Marple made her way to the village tavern, a low-ceilinged, smoke-filled place where the past hung thick in the air like the scent of stale beer and damp wood. The men who gathered here were older, weathered by time, their faces carved with the weight of things they refused to say aloud. Veterans, mostly. The ones who had been there. The ones who had seen what no one else had. She spotted him easily. Charles, once a soldier. Once a loyal man under Wyndham's command. He sat near the fireplace, hunched over a glass, staring into the flames as if they held something only he could see. Miss Marple approached slowly, slipping into the seat across from him without asking permission. Some things required patience. This was one of them. "It's been a while, hasn't it, Charles?" she said, her voice light, almost conversational. The old man didn't look at her right away. Instead he let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around his glass. "Better than I deserve," he muttered, voice rough with age and regret. "But that doesn't mean much around here." She let the silence stretch between them. Sometimes, silence did more than words ever could. Then, softly, "You were at Verdun." The name fell between them like a stone in deep water. Charles stiffened. His grip on the glass went white-knuckled. He didn't speak, but his jaw clenched, and Miss Marple saw it, the flicker of something buried deep, something that had never truly left him. Finally his voice came, rough and edged with something dangerously close to fear. "Wyndham," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was no better than a snake. His eyes flickered to hers then, something sharp and unreadable in them. "And Collingwood?" Miss Marple asked, watching him closely. The old soldier's lips pressed together. He looked away. "Wyndham deserved what he got," he said finally, his tone flat. "But Collingwood? That's the real question, isn't it?" Miss Marple felt it then, the shift in the air. The truth wasn't just tangled in the past, it was still alive, and someone was willing to kill to keep it buried. The grass always playing the game, hiding behind his rank. He paused, his hand trembling as he reached for his glass. "But Collingwood, I don't know."
Hey.
He was different. He kept his demons as soldiers. Soldier, they said, but even he had his demons. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Demons?" Charles leaned forward, lowering his voice. "They didn't just kill on orders. No, not like the others. They chose who died. You understand?" Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind turning the information over, choosing who died. That wasn't the type of thing soldiers were supposed to do, but in war anything was possible. She had known it before, and she knew it now. Later that day, Miss Marple visited the local records office. The clerk behind the counter was nervous, glancing over his shoulder as he passed her. The files she requested, she wasn't sure what he was afraid of. Perhaps it was simply the weight of what she was asking, or perhaps it was something deeper. As she sifted through the papers, one entry caught her eye. A report filed by a superior officer dated during the height of the war. The operation mentioned in the report was vague, a military maneuver that had gone wrong, but the details surrounding it were murky to say the least. The names of the men involved were scrubbed clean. Except for Wyndham and Collingwood, the rest had been redacted. Her eyes narrowed there. It was again the same pattern, the same attempts to bury the truth. It was becoming clear. The war hadn't ended just because the guns had fallen silent. It had left something behind, a darkness, a debt that would eventually come. Due that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Miss Marple stood on the street corner, her mind a whirlwind of new revelations. She had more pieces now, the names, the dates, the whispered secrets. They were all starting to fit together. The threads of the web were drawing tighter, and the truth was close. But so was the danger. She looked up at the sky, where the last light of day hung in the air like a promise. The night would come soon enough, but by then Miss knew the web would be fully spun, and when it was, the truth would finally be revealed. She took one last look at the estate, looming in the distance, the shadows stretching long over the ground. The game was still in play, and she wasn't about to lose. Not now, not after everything she'd uncovered. She turned and walked into the night, the quiet hum of the village, fading behind her. The inn was quiet when Miss Marple returned, the kind of silence that felt almost too complete. It wrapped itself around her, like the thick fog that clung to the village. At night she didn't mind it. In fact, she welcomed it. The solitude gave her space to think, time to sift through the details, to separate the truth from the noise. She locked the door behind her, a small deliberate click that echoed in the otherwise empty room. The corkboard on the wall stood like a silent witness to her work. Photographs, notes, clippings, each pinned carefully to the board in the methodical way Miss Marple had worked for decades. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered before her, each one telling a story, each one leading somewhere, but she wasn't fooled by the neatness of it all. The board wasn't just a record of facts, it was a battleground. Each clue was a weapon, and the game wasn't over yet. Some of those clues were distractions, misleading, planted with purpose by someone who didn't want the truth to surface. The question was who. She leaned forward, her sharp eyes tracing the lines between the dates and names, the connections that had once seemed like dead ends. The murder so simple, so clear, or so it had seemed. But the more she studied it, the more she saw the subtle threads running through the events. A web, a carefully spun web, meant to snare not just the victim, but anyone who came too close earlier that day. She had revisited the scene of the crime, sifting through the details of the night. Wyndham had been, the weather had been, the estate dark. A few locals had claimed to see a figure moving around the house late in the evening, but no one had seen the face. No one could agree on who it had been. Some said it was a visitor, some were not familiar to the village, others said it was just the wind playing tricks on tired eyes. Miss Marple had listened to the stories, letting them wash over her. She didn't need the distractions. The answer lay not in the shadows of the estate, but in the details that had been overlooked. The mysterious visitor had been a red herring. The timing of the murder had been far too deliberate for it to be a coincidence. A visitor at the wrong place, at the wrong time. Unlikely. This wasn't a random encounter, it was part of something larger, a carefully crafted moment in a much longer, much darker story. She leaned back, her fingers touching the edges of a photograph on the board. A younger Wyndham standing beside Captain Edward Collingwood, in full military regalia. The two men, once inseparable, now stood at opposite ends of the spectrum. One had ended up dead, and the other a defendant in a trial that had brought more questions than answers. Miss Marple had already crossed out the possibility that Collingwood was the sole culprit. There was more to this than just a man taking revenge on his former superior. Much more. Her gaze shifted to the timeline of the war. One operation stood out. Veron, the name had been repeated in every conversation, every whisper that had passed between the villages. Veron wasn't just a battle, it was the scene of a betrayal. She had seen it before, in the subtle glances exchanged in the courthouse, in the voices that shook when certain names were mentioned. Wyndham and Collingwood had both been there. They had both witnessed things done, things that could never be undone. But what had really happened there, and why had the anniversary of the event been chosen so deliberately for the murder? She stood up, her mind clicking into place, as if a lock had been turned. The date, the timing, the anniversary. It hadn't been a spur of the moment active violence, it had been a reckoning, a reminder that the past, no matter how deeply buried, would always come back. It was the kind of thing you couldn't outrun, no matter how hard you tried. The pieces fell into place. The murder had been a message, a calculated move. Wyndham's death wasn't just about revenge, it was about forcing Collingwood to face the truth of what had happened in Verdun. Someone had wanted to make sure he did. Miss Marple turned back to the corkboard, her gaze lingering on the letters she had gathered. The letter from Roland Weiser, mentioning Verdun, the crumbled note from the anxious ex-soldier in the library, the one who had warned her not to look too deeply, the carefully worded statements from witnesses, all too eager to point fingers, but never quite willing to reveal the truth. She pulled one of the notes closer. A name stood out. She'd seen it before, lurking on the edges of every conversation. The man was a shadow, an enigma, but he was involved. She was sure of it. Now Miss Marple's mind raced. She had it. She had the story, and it was even darker than she had suspected. She stood still for a moment, letting the realization sink in. The web had been carefully woven, each thread pulling tighter until the end was in sight. All she needed now was the right confrontation, the one that would expose everything, unravel the lies and pull back the curtain on the real murderer. But who had been the true architect of this plan? Weiser, Collingwood, Or had Wyndham's own guilt been his undoing? Her hand rested on the corkboard, her fingers tracing the lines of the timeline. One last time the confrontation was close, the pieces were aligned, but there was still more work to be done. Miss Marple glanced out the window where the evening light was, fading into the darkness of night. She felt it now, the weight of history pressing in on her. The truth was coming, and when it arrived, it would tear through everything like a storm. She took one last look at the board, her expression hardening. This wasn't just about solving a murder, it was about uncovering a truth that had been buried for too long, a truth that would change everything. With a thin glance, Miss Marple turned from the board and moved toward the door. There was no more time to wait. The web was nearly complete, and the confrontation awaited. The village hall had never felt smaller. The high wooden beam which once stood as the proud bones of the building now seemed to close in on the assembly. Yes. Many of them old war comrades, shifted uneasily in their seats, their eyes darting between the door and the empty stage. The room hummed with a quiet energy, low voices, the scrape of chairs, the flick of a nervous hand against a sleeve. Ex-soldiers lined the walls, their hardened faces betraying nothing but the tension in the room was palpable. The legal representatives sat together at the front, faces unreadable, as they waited for Miss Marple to speak. Everyone was on edge, but nobody more than Captain Collingwood, who sat toward back, his posture stiff, eyes fixed, straight ahead, but never quite focusing on anything he had been told to come, told to face the truth. Now, the waiting was the hardest part. Miss Marple stood alone, at the front of the hall, poised and unbothered by the charged. The hands rested gently on the podium before her, her eyes sweeping over the assembly. Her calm demeanor cut through the tension like a knife, and for a moment, the room held its collective breath. The clock on the wall ticked. And then, with a faint smile, Miss Marple began. "Thank you all for gathering," she said, her voice soft but sharp enough to command attention. "I understand this may be a difficult day, but I assure you the truth will not remain hidden for long." She paused, letting the words sink in the room. Quieted further, if that was even possible. Every eye, every ear was tuned to her. Miss Marple had never been one for dramatic flourishes. She didn't need them. Her mind worked with the precision of a well-oiled machine, and today her facts were about to do the talking. She began slowly recounting the timeline of events. "It all started, as you all know, with the death of Major Wyndham," she said, her tone almost conversational. "The night he died, the weather was clear, the estate quiet, yet something about that night felt different. It was not a random act of violence, it was deliberate." A reckoning, her eyes flicked briefly toward Collingwood, his face as unmoved as stone. "It was not just murder," Miss Marple continued. "It was a message, a confrontation with a past that could no longer remain buried." She moved toward the chalkboard, at the side of the stage where she had already marked the key dates and events. The anniversary of Varan, the day of Wyndham's death, the mysterious visitor who had been seen near the estate. "Let us begin," she said, turning to the crowd at Varan. During the war, two men stood side by side, Major Wyndham and Captain Edward Collingwood, a decision made in the heat of battle, a decision that sealed the fates of men. Long after the war had ended, there was a stir in the room, a sudden tension. Miss Marple let it hang for a moment. She knew the weight of her words were sinking in Varan, the place of betrayal. Miss Marple murmured, "A covert operation that led to the deaths of innocent soldiers, an order carried out not for the greater good, but for personal gain." She paused, letting the silence stretch, then turned back to the assembly. But it wasn't just one man's mistake. She picked up the photograph from the desk. Wyndham and Collingwood, standing in side by side, younger and full of pride. The same two men had been involved in a war crime, buried deep beneath their shared history. Miss Marple turned the photo around, showing it to the crowd, the image almost mocking them in its simplicity. This photograph, taken before the war, had truly darkened their hearts. "Tells a story. It was hidden from all of you until now," she continued, her voice steady. "But this photograph, and the evidence we've gathered, speak of something else. something that those in power tried to erase. Turning to the board, she outlined the connections, the coded letter found in Wyndham's study, the photograph of the two men during the war, and most importantly, the timing of Wyndham's death. It wasn't by chance that it occurred on the anniversary of Varan. It was intentional. The murderer wanted to force a confrontation with the past. Her eyes scanned the crowd, and she could see the unease spreading face, turned pale. Some looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Miss Marple took a breath, then continued, "You see, this wasn't just an act of vengeance. It was an attempt to bring closure to a shared crime. Wyndham was guilty, but the real question is who was the person seeking justice, who was the one who needed to force Wyndham to confront his sins, and why now?" She turned her gaze to Collingwood, who was sitting stiffly in his seat. His knuckles were white around the edge of the chair, his eyes scanning the floor in front of him. But Miss Marple could tell his mind was moving quickly, trying to piece together the scattered facts. She wasn't fooled. She had seen enough men like him trying to keep control, while their pasts threatened to break free. "It was you, wasn't it, Collingwood?" she said, her voice sharp but quiet. "You were the one who needed Wyndham to face the consequences of his actions. You were the one who sought to make him pay for it. What happened at Verdun?" Collingwood didn't flinch, but Miss Marple saw the slight twitch in his jaw. He wasn't the stout, unshakable man he had been in court. Not now. He was unraveling. The room held its breath as Miss Marple moved closer, but she continued, "What you did not account for was the involvement of others who had their own reasons for wanting Wyndham dead, others whose lives were tied to the darkness of that night." She turned to the rest of the room, her gaze sweeping across the witnesses, the legal team, and the gathered soldiers. "You were all complicit in your way. By turning a blind eye, protecting your own interests, you allowed this secret to fester, until it finally became too much to bear, and someone decided to end it." She turned back to Collingwood, her voice becoming quieter. "Now, now more controlled. The real question is not who killed Wyndham, but why the murder had to happen when it did. It wasn't just revenge, it was a reckoning with the past that would never be allowed to fade away." The air in the room seemed to still as Miss Marple let the weight of her words settle over the gathered crowd. Collingwood's face remained impassive, but she could see the subtle shift in his demeanor, the barely noticeable tremor in his hand, as clenched at his side. The pieces were all in place. Now the murder had been carefully orchestrated, the date chosen to force the confrontation with the ghosts of the past, and now the truth was laid bare, for everyone to see. Miss Marple stood still, her gaze steady, as she looked out at the faces of the men and women in the room. The game was over. The web of deceit had been unraveled, and the truth was now inescapable. The village hall had all the grandeur could muster: paintings on the walls, carved wooden beams overhead, a floor so polished it almost gleamed in the dim light, but it felt too small, now cramped with too many secrets, and too much history, that had nowhere to go but fall. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind you couldn't touch, but could feel in the tightness around your chest. Miss Marple stood at the front of the room, her small delicate figure commanding attention in a way only those who know how to be still can. The wooden chairs creaked beneath the weight of the audience, locals, ex-soldiers, a few legal representatives, all uneasy, some sweating under the pressure, others barely containing the bubbling tension in their throats. The room was silent, waiting. Miss Marple didn't waste time. She turned slightly toward the chalkboard, where the timeline of events was drawn out in careful detail, dates, names, a few scribbled connections that had once seemed meaningless, but now felt like the crux of it all. "Gentlemen and ladies," she began, her voice calm yet cutting through the tension like a blade, "we've gathered here today to answer one question: who killed Major Wyndham?" She paused, letting the words sink in. A few faces stiffened at the mention of the victim, but no one dared speak. But many versions of the truth. Miss Marple continued, her gaze sweeping over the room from testimonies of witness to speculation, of motives to rumors passed in whispers. "But let us now look at the facts. The facts that have been laid before us, hard and undeniable. She walked over to the table, where several pieces of evidence lay: the photograph, the letter, the reports. She pointed to them one by one, allowing the weight of each one to land like a stone. Major Wyndham and Captain Collingwood, she began, turning toward the crowd, were both part of a covert military operation during the war. Both men participated in actions that they knew would come back to haunt them. She glanced toward Captain Collingwood, his face stone-like, his jaw tight, but his eyes flickering ever so slightly. The war wasn't just a battle of armies, Miss Marple said. It was a battle of choices, of betrayals, and of guilt. Wyndham and Collingwood were both guilty of something, but what her gaze lingered on Collingwood for a moment, and she noticed a faint shift in his posture, as if he were bracing for something he knew was coming. The truth is, Miss Marple continued, her voice growing steadier, Weem was not just a victim, he was a man who had orchestrated a cover-up, a man who had buried the truth for years. But what he couldn't bury was the guilt, and what he didn't account for was that guilt catching up with him. The room grew still. Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed on Collingwood, who was now staring down at the floor, his hands clenched at his sides. "I know you've all heard the rumors that it was a crime of passion, a simple act of revenge," Miss Marple said, her voice almost a whisper. "But it was not that it wasn't revenge, it was a reckoning." Gasps rippled through the hall, as the full weight of her words landed. The whispers that had once been casual, now buzzed louder, filling the space with a sense of disbelief. She looked directly at Collingwood. "It was you, wasn't it? You who, in a moment of moral and emotional turmoil, fatally shot Major Wyndham." Collingwood's eyes flickered, and for the briefest moment, a flash of guilt crossed his face. His fingers twitched as though he were about to rise from his seat, but he stayed frozen. "The motive was not revenge," Miss Marple said, her voice clear and unwavering. "It was a desperate attempt to expose Wyndham's long-hidden role in a brutal wartime cover-up." "Collingwood, you couldn't live with the secret any longer. You couldn't live with the knowledge of what you'd both done, the lives that had been taken because of it. Wyndham had used you, and you had used him, but the weight of it was too much to bear." The room was silent, now, save for the quiet gasps of realization. Every eye was fixed on Miss Marple, as she continued, her words cutting through the air, like the strike of a clock's chime. "The night Wyndham was killed, Collingwood knew it was time. It was the anniversary of the day. Both men had sealed their fates, and so, in a final act of moral conviction, you confronted Wyndham. You confronted him with the truth that had never been spoken, and you did what you had to do." Miss Marple took a step back, allowing the crowd's murmurs to rise and swell like a storm. Collingwood's gaze remained fixed on the floor, his shoulders tense, but he did not speak. There was nothing left to say. The confrontation took place in the drawing room. Miss Marple said, her voice soft, now almost a murmur. "Wyndham was unarmed, as he always was when he met Collingwood. They spoke, perhaps even tried to justify themselves, but in the end, Collingwood had to make the choice, and he did. One shot, one life taken, to stop the truth from ever being buried again." Collingwood's hand moved, ever so slightly, as if he were trying to steady himself. Miss Marple looked at him, her gaze calm, but her words sharp. "You thought you could silence the past, Collingwood," Miss Marple said, softly, "but the past doesn't stay silent. It waits, it watches, and when it's ready, it comes back." The room seemed to hold its breath. It was as if the very air had changed, heavy with the weight of the truth. Collingwood remained motionless, his jaw clenched so tight that it seemed as though he would shatter. But Miss Marple wasn't done. "And what about the rest of you?" she asked, her gaze sweeping over the witnesses in the room. "You knew, didn't you? Some of you knew what happened, what Wyndham and Collingwood were involved in. You turned a blind eye, and for that, you too carry the weight of this crime." She stood still for a moment, her expression unreadable. "But today, that weight is lifted, because today the truth has been spoken." The finality of it was deafening. The room seemed to close in on itself, as Miss Marple stepped back from the podium. Her gaze remained steady, unyielding. Collingwood remained silent, his face drained of all color, his body still outside. The wind howled through the village, carrying with it the faintest whispers of the past. Miss Marple knew it wasn't over. Not yet. There would be questions, and there would be repercussions, but for now she had done what she came to do. The truth had been revealed, and with it, the ghosts of Varan would finally be put to rest. The moment Miss Marple finished speaking, the silence in the village hall pressed down like a thick blanket. Her words had cut through the murmur of disbelief, and turned it into a quiet, oppressive weight. The truth was out now, naked and undeniable, and the air in the room was heavier for it. Captain Edward Collingwood, sitting at the back of the hall, still hadn't moved his face, which had remained set throughout the entire proceeding. Now betrayed something deeper. His eyes, once steely and determined, were now clouded with a mixture of sorrow, shame, and an almost imperceptible resolve. His body remained rigid, as if the truth had physically anchored him in place. He wasn't surprised. He knew deep down that Miss Marple had been circling the truth for days, but hearing it laid bare before everyone was something else entirely. A few of the witnesses shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging furtive glances. The soldiers, hardened men who had borne witness to the worst of humanity, now seemed smaller. Somehow they were trapped in a web they hadn't expected to be caught in, each of them unknowingly complicit in the deceits that had festered beneath the surface for so long. The room was thick with remorse, that quiet, choking kind of regret that lingers when something irreversible has happened. There was no turning back now. The murder, the lies, the decades-long cover-up, it was all exposed in front of them, no longer something whispered in corners, but something everyone had to confront. The quiet hum of whispers rose like a swell of water, only to fall back into silence every time someone met another's gaze. It was like they were all holding their breath, unsure of what to do. Next, the air around Collingwood seemed to vibrate with the weight of the unspoken. Miss Marple didn't have to look at him to know his mind was racing, his past inextricably tangled with the present. He had done it. Of that there was no doubt, but the why, the desperate need to confront Wyndham, to force him to face the past that still hovered like a shadow in the room. But it was done now. The truth had spilled out, and Collingwood could only sit there and bear it. The atmosphere remained tense as the assembly began to slowly disperse, a reluctant resignation in the air. People shuffled out of the hall, heads low, unsure of how to proceed. Some were still in shock, others simply relieved it was over, but all of them carried the weight of what had been revealed. They would never look at each other the same way again. The ties that bound them, whether through war or through their complicity, were now permanently altered. Miss Marple remained standing at the front, her sharp eyes following the slow exodus of the crowd. She had done what she set out to do. She had unraveled the tangled web of deceit that had strangled the truth for so long, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't quite over. The shadows of the past were not so easily dismissed. They would linger
at those who had been involved,
unable to be washed away by the simple revealing of the truth. Her gaze fell back on Collingwood, who had finally stood up, his back slightly hunched, his steps slow and deliberate. Seemed smaller now, less the proud officer, more a man who had been crushed by the weight of his own conscience. He didn't look at anyone as he passed, his face drawn tight with conflict, a man who was perhaps more a victim of his own choices than anyone else. The hall emptied, the last few people leaving in a kind of daze, their eyes glazed as if the weight of the truth had made them forget where they were. Miss Marple waited until the room had emptied, save for the lingering hum of voices outside her own mind. Though quiet, was still processing everything. She had known from the start that it would take time, patience and attention to piece together the events surrounding Wyndham's death, but even now, after the words had been spoken, she felt a lingering unease. The truth had been laid bare, but there were still pieces missing, still corners in which the past could hide, half-formed, and unwilling to show its face as the last of the crowd filtered out.
Miss Marple gave one last glance toward the door.
Her hands clasped in front of her, she knew that even now, as the hall emptied, there was no such thing as closure, not for Collingwood, certainly, and not for the others. They would leave, but the shadow of their past would follow them outside. The cool night air greeted her like an old friend. The village was quieter, narrow streets bathed in the pale glow of a single street lamp, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Miss Marple stepped out, feeling the night settle around her like a blanket, her silhouette with the darkness, as she walked, her footsteps muffled against the cobblestones. The events of the day had unfolded as they were meant to, but the lingering questions tugged at the back of her mind. Collingwood had faced his reckoning, but so many others had danced around the truth for so long that the ripples of the revelation would continue to spread. The village was still too still. Miss Marple knew the quiet before a storm, and there was something in the air now, something that spoke of unfinished business. She stopped in the middle of the street, her face contemplative. The night, dark and heavy, seemed to watch her as she stood there, letting the weight of the world sit on her shoulders for a moment longer. There would be consequences. The past would never truly stay buried, and the truth had a way of finding its way back when you least expected it. Miss Marple took a slow breath and started walking again.
His story wasn't over.
Not yet. The morning after the confrontation in the village hall, little
Fleas woke to a world that felt both heavier and lighter.
All at once, the sky was clear, and the sun crept over the rooftops like a hesitant witness, shining on a place that had just shared its darkest secret. The streets, as always, were quiet, but there was an energy in the air now, one that had been absent for far too long. The weight of the previous day hung on the village, but so did the air of change. The local newspaper stands by mid-morning, its headline bold and unyielding: Verdun's ghosts. Captain Collingwood confesses to the murder of Major Wyndham. Beneath the headline, smaller print told the story of the investigation that had shocked the village and the nation. The details were laid out plainly, leaving nothing to the imagination. Collingwood's confession had sent shockwaves through the community, but it was the second half of the headline that caught the most attention. Public inquiry into wartime cover-up to begin. It was all anyone could talk about that morning. The newspaper found its way into the hands of nearly everyone who passed through the village square. Groups of people huddled together, the murmurs growing louder as the facts were exchanged like currency. Some whispered their relief that the truth had finally come to light. Others muttered about the fairness of it all. Was it justice? Or was it just another symptom of a war that had taken more than just soldiers? The quiet hum of everyday life resumed in Little Thistle, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the gentle stillness of a village unused to trouble. It was the silence of a community collectively holding its breath. Shopkeepers went about their business, but their eyes flicked nervously to the corners where whispers stirred. Old friends exchanged words at the bakery counter, but their tone was more subdued now, as if everything had changed even in the mundane. Miss Marple moved through the village with her usual composure, her pace unhurried but steady. The sun warmed her face, but she felt no particular pleasure in it. Her mind was preoccupied with the aftermath of what had transpired, not just for Collingwood, but for the village as a whole. The puzzle had been solved, but the pieces had left a mark, one that would take time to fade. She stopped by the village green, watching as a small group of men gathered in the corner, their heads bent in discussion. The weight of the revelation had left each of them uncertain, unsure of how to reconcile the man they had known with the actions he had taken. Some of them had fought beside Collingwood during the war, and the betrayal stung all the more for that. But Miss Marple wasn't interested in the idle chatter of the townsfolk. She was interested in the fallout. The truth had been revealed, but the damage to the community's sense of peace was far from repaired. She observed them for a moment longer before continuing her walk, each step deliberate. By the time Miss Marple reached the courthouse, it was already buzzing with activity. The legal machinery had kicked into motion. Captain Collingwood had been charged with the murder of Major Wyndham, and the proceedings would begin soon enough. But it wasn't just the murder trial that kept the village on edge. The broader inquiry into the wartime cover-up was a separate matter, one that promised to stir up far more than anyone could anticipate. The courthouse was old, its stone walls thick and imposing. Inside, the wooden benches creaked as officials shuffled papers and took their seats. The trial would be brief. Collingwood had confessed after all, but it was the public inquiry that promised to uncover more than anyone was ready to hear. Miss Marple wasn't concerned with the legal outcome, but she knew the weight of what was coming. Collingwood might face consequences for his crime, but the systemic rot that had allowed such horrors to occur was another matter entirely. As she walked past the rows of reporters and onlookers gathering in the hall, Miss Marple noticed a few familiar faces, those of soldiers who had fought with Collingwood and Wyndham. Their faces were strained, their gazes uncertain. They had known the men as comrades, as leaders, but now they were forced to see them as they were flawed, broken, guilty. Later, as Miss Marple sat in the back of the courtroom, the trial unfolded with predictability. Captain Collingwood sat at the defendant's table, his posture still rigid, his eyes fixed on the judge as though trying to will the truth to be undone, but there was no undoing it. Now his confession had been clear and unambiguous. The witnesses, including the key players from the village, had corroborated the facts. The prosecution moved quickly, the case against Collingwood airtight. Miss Marple had no doubt that the trial would end in conviction, but she couldn't help but feel that the justice being served was only a small part of a much larger reckoning. Collingwood would face his punishment for the murder, but there was still the question of the war, of the lives taken by those in positions of power, Wyndham, Collingwood and others who remained nameless. The courtroom felt smaller as the trial wore on, the weight of history pressing in, the murmur of the crowd, the rustling of papers. All seemed distant, as if Miss Marple were outside it all, looking in. The murder of Wyndham was no longer just an isolated crime, it was the visible wound, the one that everyone could see. But the deeper wounds, the ones that had festered under the surface, remained. In the days that followed, the village held its breath as the public inquiry began. It wasn't just about the murder anymore, it was about the war, about the men who had manipulated it for their own gain. Inquiry was more than just a legal procedure, it was a reckoning. The officials called in witnesses, soldiers who had been part of the same operations, men who had been complicit without even knowing it. They were forced to reckon with their own guilt, their own part in a system that had been built on lies. The inquiry was long, dragging out over several weeks, with more secrets coming to light. Each day the full scope of the wartime cover-up was revealed in pieces, each more disturbing than the last, and with each revelation the villagers were left to wrestle with their own roles in the story, how much they had known, how much they had been willing to ignore. For Miss Marple, the inquiry was the final piece in a puzzle that she had already solved, but it wasn't about solving it anymore, it was about what happened afterward, the consequences of the truth. Collingwood might face justice for his crime, but the deeper sins of the past would require a different kind of reckoning, one that no court could deliver. As the inquiry drew to a close, Miss Marple stood outside the courthouse, watching the last of the witnesses file out. The air was cool, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows on the street. She walked slowly, her thoughts turning inward, but a quiet satisfaction settled over her. The truth had been laid bare. For better or worse, there was no going back, and as Miss Marple disappeared into the quiet of the evening, her silhouette blending with the twilight, she knew that even this revelation would leave its marks that time would never fully erase. The morning light fell weakly through the clouds, casting a dull grey hue over Little Thistle. It was a place that had once known only quiet routine, but now, with the revelations of the past days still fresh in the air, it felt different. The streets were quieter than usual, the normal hum of village life subdued, as if the entire community were holding its breath, waiting for something to shift in the world they had once known. Miss Marple walked down the main lane, her pace steady, her steps unhurried. The air was cool, but not unpleasant, just the kind of day that suited her reflective mood. Her thoughts, though outwardly calm, was still running, picking over the events that had unfolded in the village in the last week, the trial, the confession, the inevitable aftermath. Each piece had fallen into place, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something remained just out of reach. She passed by the houses, some still sport in drapes drawn tight against the light. The windows, though clean, now seemed to hide more than they revealed. It wasn't just the shadows inside that made the village feel like a place of secrets. It was the way the people moved faster now, with a little more tension in their step, as if the truth they had once feared to confront was now a permanent fixture in their lives. Miss Marple's gaze wandered toward the distant edge of town, where the fields began, and the ancient oaks lined the country. Leliel, she turned off the main path, and into the quiet shade of the trees. The ground beneath her shoes, soft and leaf-strewn, the air smelled of earth, of damp leaves, of the quiet breath of nature. It was a respite, a brief return to something untainted, where the past seemed to fade, and the weight of the world felt a little less heavy. The wall, the great wall, had changed everything. She knew that what it wasn't just the men who had fought, but everyone who had witnessed it, who had lived through it. They carried it with them, even if they didn't speak of it, even if they buried it deep beneath layers of time and shame. There were those in the village who had walked the line between duty and betrayal, who had chosen to ignore the truth when it was convenient, when it fit into their lives. Wyndham, Collingwood, all those caught up in the web. They had done what they had done for reasons Miss Marple could never fully understand. Some did it for power, some for survival, and some perhaps because they could. But the war had left no one untouched, and the truth, like the dust of the battlefield, would not stay buried forever. She paused, leaning against one of the ancient oaks, her hands clasped in front of her eyes, closed for a moment. The wind rustled, the leaves carrying with it fragments of forgotten conversations, voices from the past. For a brief moment, she was back there in the years when the war had raged. She could see the faces of the men who had returned, scarred, broken, yet still holding on to the remnants of what they had been before. She could hear the murmurs of soldiers recounting tales, mixing truth with lie, fact with fiction, all trying to make sense of a world that had given them no sense at all. It was in these quiet moments of reflection that Miss Marple found clarity. Justice, she knew, wasn't always a clean thing. It didn't always come with a satisfying conclusion, neatly wrapped up in a bow. Sometimes the truth was messy, tangled in the threads of the past, hidden beneath layers of pride and fear. But one thing she had learned over the years was this: truth had a way of making itself known. Even if it took years, even if it took generations, it would find its way to the surface. It was inevitable, and in that inevitability, there was something profoundly reassuring. Collingwood would face the consequences of his action. His guilt, his confession were public, now undeniable. But what of Wyndham? What of the others who had walked away unscathed, who had turned their backs when it was easiest? The real question, Miss Marple mused, was whether anyone would ever truly face what they had done during the war. She wasn't sure that they would. Sometimes the sins of the past were too big, too deep to ever be fully reconciled, but that too was part of the journey. People would move on just as the village would. There would be no more whispers about Wyndham's murder, no more stares when Collingwood walked the streets, but the truth, she suspected, would still hang in the air like smoke. She straightened the weight of her thoughts, still with her, but no longer pressing her down. The village would move forward as it always did. Life would go on, but it would be different now, and that too was a kind of justice. As Miss Marple made her way back to the village, the sun was setting, the sky streaked with gold and pink. She didn't hurry. There was no need. The day would end, as the days always did, and tomorrow would come with its own set of challenges. Well, but for now there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the truth had been revealed, that the wrongs of the past had in some more way been set right. She glanced back toward the path she had walked, her silhouette merging with the evening light. The village was receding in the distance, its streets lined with shadows, the houses tucked behind trees and fences. It was still the same village, but not entirely. Things had changed, and perhaps they always would. But that was how it had to be. The road ahead was uncertain, as it always was. The past would remain with them, lingering just beneath the surface, a reminder of the choices that had been made, the lives that had been lost. But Miss Marple was content with what she had done, content with the knowledge that justice in some form had been served, and so she walked on, the village fading behind her, her thoughts already turning to the next mystery, the next puzzle. There would always be more to uncover, more to learn, but for now Little Thistle had its answer, and that was enough. Miss Marple stood in the doorway of the small ivy, clad in her gaze, drifting across the village of Little Thistle, as the last light of day slipped quietly behind the village lay under a veil of silence, the kind that settles after a storm, not peaceful, but watchful, as if the air itself held its breath. The trial was over, the secrets had been unearthed, and the weight of revelation had settled over Little Thistle, like dust on forgotten furniture. Yet in the stillness of the evening, the echoes of the past had not entirely faded. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the cobbled street, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. The air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. The few remaining villagers who braved the night passed by quickly, heads low, voices hushed. They had seen too much, heard too much. Justice had been served, or so the courts had declared. But Miss Marple knew better. Justice was not always a clean thing, not always wrapped up neatly in a judge's verdict. Sometimes it was merely the acknowledgement of truth, dragged from the depths where it had been buried for far too long. And sometimes, even that was not enough. She took a deep breath, letting the cold settle in her lungs. It was a pause, a moment between the closing of one chapter and the uneasy beginning of another. The world had a way of continuing on, even after tragedy had left its mark. But scars did not fade so easily. Wyndham was dead. Collingwood had confessed. The village had heard the details of their crimes, their betrayals, their sins committed not just in war, but in the years that followed. Yet no trial, no public reckoning, could erase what had been done. Miss Marple had seen it before, in countless places, in countless ways. War did not end on the battlefield. It lived on in the men who had fought it, in the choices they had made, in the weight of the past that clung to their bones. Some wounds never healed, they only sank deeper, festering beneath the surface, until the truth finally forced its way through. She moved slowly down the lane, her boots tapping softly against the buildings, their old timbers weathered and worn, seemed to watch her pass with the quiet knowing of a place that had seen too much. Some villagers would move on, eager to forget, to close the book on a chapter that had unsettled their quarrel. But others, they would never escape it, because justice, no matter how final, did not fall evenly. There were those who carried guilt, and there were those who carried the weight of consequences. Not all were equally to blame, and yet, all had been touched by what had happened. Some men had acted out of duty, others out of cowardice. Some had wielded power like a weapon, others had simply chosen to look away, and yet, none of them had walked away unscathed. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the men of Verdun, to the ghosts that still walked unseen through the village. Wyndham and Collingwood had made their choices long ago, choices that had led them to their respective fates. But what of the others, the ones who had survived, who had carried those terrible secrets in silence? The truth was like a stone dropped into deep water. It sent ripples out, disturbing even the ones who thought themselves untouched. As she reached the inn, its windows glowing with the dim amber light of the hearth inside, she hesitated, looking back over her shoulder. She took in the village one last time. Little Thistle had changed. Whether it would admit it or not, it had been altered by the weight of the past and the revelation of truth. And perhaps, she thought, she had changed as well. Not that she would ever say so aloud, because justice was never perfect. It did not undo the past, nor did it return the dead to the living. But the search for truth, that was its own kind of redemption. Some questions would never be fully answered. The complexities of human nature, of greed, of jealousy, of fear, would remain tangled, as they always were. But Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. In the search for truth, there was always the possibility of change. And in that possibility, however faint, however uncertain, there was hope. She stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her. Outside, the village stretched on, quiet and endless, like the mystery of life itself.